from Tachyon Press. Spaceships, ray guns, Martian octopods. Interviews with science fiction legends. Edited by Richard Wolinski. In these extremely candid radio transcripts, more than 50 legendary, larger-than-life personalities recount anecdotes about the lawless era known as the Golden Age of science fiction. Ray Bradbury, Harlan Ellison, Philip K. Dick, Isaac Asimov, Margaret Atwood, Fritz Leiber, Frank Herbert, and many more describe the wild personalities, contentious debates, and vivid imaginations that made science fiction thrive. Richard Wolinski and his co-hosts interviewed a veritable who's who of famous and infamous science fiction publishers, pulp magazine editors, cover artists, and fans. The interviews, which aired on the radio show Probabilities, span over 20 years from just before the release of Star Wars through the dawn of Y2K. Bruce Sterling says, "It's a gaudy patchwork quilt of raw gossip and old radio chatter, but it's also the world's most authentic portrait of the real-life professional science fiction fantasists." Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel, and I'm not sure about the lawless golden age. This book really isn't centered on John Campbell's years from 1939 to 1950, and I certainly wouldn't say they were lawless. I mean, we definitely had a World War II in there. But John Campbell just had a grip on the magazine that really survived and defined the 1940s. But Tachyon Press is obviously trying to sell books, and so that's the way it was framed in the book blurb. Now, you would think that we have 40 interviews in this book, just back to back to back. That's not the case. Let's take a look. In looking at the table of contents, we start off with a foreword by Richard A. Lupoff and the Probabilities interviews by Richard Wolinski. And then we get into Chapter 1, the science fiction of the 1920s. Each chapter has a cast of characters. This is characters that build upon each other. They are generally science fiction authors or publishers. Sometimes there's also fans. And then each chapter has small subheadings, and each of these headings has quotes from interviews with these authors and publishers. And it continues throughout the book this way. So it's a topical book filled with quotes from writers and publishers. Let's go back again to the table of contents. Chapter 1, we're taking a look at the science fiction in the 1920s. Birth of a genre, the early pulps, Hugo Gernsback and Amazing Stories, and writers of the 20s. And you can see here that we take a look at some of these writers, in their own words and in the words of others. And then they talk about a few other magazines like Argosy and some other bottom feeders, as they put it. Chapter 2 is the story of weird tales. I couldn't help but think about Andrea from Infinite Text. She loves weird tales. In fact, she often has Weird Tales Wednesdays. She recommended this book to me. I'll put a link to her channel in the description for this video. There you can see within the chapter all the usual suspects who wrote within Weird Tales. Chapter 3 goes into the years of depression, triumph of the pulps, so that would be the 1930s. If we flip the page, we see that there's many authors of the 30s that are examined here. Chapter 4 looks at the king of science fiction, John W. Campbell, and Astounding. This really is the chapter about the golden age of science fiction. Chapter 5, World War II and Beyond, science fiction in the 40s. Chapter 6, the 50s, the world's rushes in. And Chapter 7, From the Science Fiction League to the Futurians, Fans for All. And there's an Appendix 1 that has origin stories, reading and writing, that crazy Buck Rogers stuff. And Appendix 2 has the list of interviews. Let me just show you a little bit from Appendix 2. Starting at Forrest J. Ackerman, and we have when it's recorded and who the interviewer is. The interviews are arranged in alphabetical order, so we start at Ackerman, and here you can see second page, we're on the top, we're up to Philip K. Dick. On the third page, William F. Nolan, And on the fourth page, last page, up to Roger Zelazny. So over the years, Wolinski and friends have interviewed many influential people from the origin of the pulp magazines. Wolinski does a great job of editing these interviews into these sections, into these topics. I really expected, as I said, that this would just be a book of interviews, but really it's been crafted into something much better than that. We start to learn about these authors and editors in their own voices. So many stories. It's like sitting down in the pub with a beer and listening to these guys talk. I want to give you some examples of their stories just so you can get a feel for it. Let's start with A.E. Van Vogt, someone who comes from my neck of the woods. What amazes me now, after reading Fred Pohl's The Way the Future Was that a story could be sent from as far away as Winnipeg and find a place in a New York publisher's magazine. I couldn't have found it in any magazine other than Astounding because they were all being run by in-groups. The writers were all starving to death, and they would bring their story to the editor, and only those who were a member of his in-group would be acceptable. A story of mine, like Black Destroyer, arriving on the desk of such an editor would not get anywhere at all. That story of mine left Winnipeg, Canada, as remote an outlying area from New York as you can get, I would say, on this continent at that time, arrived there on the desk of John W. Campbell, and he read it. He didn't just read the letter and say, oh, it's from Winnipeg, Canada, and send it back. No, or it's not from a local in-group member. I imagine that in-group people could wait forever in Campbell's office and not get a check immediately. Another story concerning legendary editor John W. Campbell, Jr. comes from Robert Silverberg. In the summer of 1955, I was collaborating with Randall Garrett, an older writer who had come to New York and who had sort of collapsed on my doorstep in penniless alcoholism. And I said, let's collaborate. I could write. I had the discipline. He had the scientific background. He was a chemist. So we set up a kind of factory. Suddenly, we were selling collaborative stories to John Campbell under the pseudonym of Robert Randall, a nice Anglo-Saxon name. But every time I brought a Robert Silverberg story in, John would reject it. Randy said to me one day, after this had happened 3 or 4 times, the real reason he is rejecting your stories is that he's anti-Semitic. That is to say, he respects Jews as sharp mental operators, but he doesn't want nasty Jewish names on the contents page. So he'll buy stories from you, but he would want another name. And he said, make up the most Protestant name you can think of. I said, how about Calvin Knox? After all, those are the 2 great Protestant rebels after Martin Luther. Randy laughed and said, make it Calvin M. Knox with the M for Moses. So I wrote a Calvin M. Knox story, took it to John Campbell a couple days later, and by God, he bought it. Then, just to test Randy's theory, I brought him a Robert Silverberg story a few weeks later, and he bought that. He published it. In fact, he put my name on the cover of the magazine. A couple of years later, late at night at a convention, I was sitting with John in his room. Just the 2 of us were sitting there. He had his feet up in a very uncharacteristic, relaxed position, and he said, what's the story with Calvin M. Knox? How did you make up that name? Because by that time, it was late at night, and I was feeling relaxed and no longer afraid of John Campbell, I said, well, the rumor came to me that you wouldn't use a Jewish name on a byline, so I made up the most Protestant name I could think of. John began to laugh and laugh and laugh, and then he said, have you ever heard of Isaac Asimov? Next, we have Frank Kelly Freas. I didn't know this before, but he grew up in Canada, although he was born American. In 1939, he moved back down into the United States. I've always wondered about why some of the pictures that we have would reflect so well the stories within. Apparently, sometimes the artists were given manuscripts ahead of time. Other times, editors would describe a particular scene to an artist. The only editor I ever worked with who really had illustrations down pat was Larry Shaw when he was with If magazine. He could write 3 sentences and describe exactly the picture that the story called for, and he was the only editor I knew who could do it. He had a tremendous visual imagination. And finally, we have a couple stories from that master storyteller himself, Harlan Ellison. The first one concerns Frank Belknap Long. Frank Belknap Long got paid by Leo Margulis on how many corrections he made on the manuscripts that went into Fantastic Universe. Everybody in those days was just dead broke. $45 was just about 2 weeks' rent for New York, or was 7 or 8 or 10 good meals, and $45 meant the difference between starving and not starving. Frank Belknap Long would just change stuff arbitrarily because he was getting a penny per correction. So if he could make $10 worth of corrections for each manuscript, he could make a decent wage. So that's what Frank Belknap Long did, and he butchered people's writing. And the next story has to deal with Fantastic Universe again. In 1959, Fantastic Universe was sold to a man named Henry Scharf, who had a publishing company called Great American Publications. Scharf was stiffing everybody, including poor Hans Stefan Santisson, who was near the end of his life and near the end of his career. Hans was a great man, and a very good editor indeed. They were doing a pulp magazine for a while called Tightrope, which was based on the television series that starred Mike Connors. They did a few issues of that, and they were buying mystery stories. So Hans solicited me, and he bought a terrible story, absolutely terrible, probably the worst story I've ever wrote. Only Death Can Stop It. It was about 2,300 or 2,400 words, and it was a penny a word, and I was supposed to be paid. Hans wanted to pay me out of his own pocket, but he didn't have the money because Scharf was stiffing him. So I went to collect it myself. A little further on. So I put on my one good suit, a gray flannel suit, and I wore a hat, and I had my umbrella, and I looked like a businessman. And I came in, and I said to the receptionist, "Henry Scharf, please." And she said, "Whom should I say is calling?" I said, "Tell him it's Mr. Diderot from the Internal Revenue Service, Manhattan branch." And I was inside in about 3 seconds. And when I got inside, he reached across and grabbed my hand to shake my hand, and I grabbed him and I said, "I ain't Diderot. My name's Ellison. You owe me $32. Give me my money." And he started screaming and yelling and hollering. There was a huge bullpen outside with all kinds of secretaries typing away madly on things, and I went dashing out one door of his office on one side as everybody came running in the main door of the office around the other side. By the time I got around out into the bullpen area, there was nobody left. Everybody had run in the other direction. So I grabbed the typewriter, one of those great big ones. It was the Mosler Safe building on 5th Avenue downtown, right around 37th Street, something like that. And I ran down, 10 or 12 flights because I couldn't take the elevator. I ran down the stairs, then I ran up to 7th Avenue, 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, and I found a hawk shop, and I pawned it for $50-something, and I made a clear profit of $13-14. I hope you get a feel for this book from these stories. One of the things I found fascinating is I've been collecting the best of a number of different science fiction authors. And as you can see on my bookshelf here, many of the authors that were collected for these best ofs were ones that were interviewed by Richard Wolinski and friends. It made that background reading even more special for me. So if you're a person who really appreciates the history of science fiction, in particular the history of the pulp magazines, and would love to hear some stories, some gossip from the writers and editors and fans themselves, this book is for you. Now, as with any storytelling by these folks, they're great stories, but I don't know exactly how factual they are. But it sure is a great insight into the people behind some of the books and stories that we love. I give Spaceships, Ray Guns, and Martian Octopods 8.5 out of 10. A book you would really appreciate if you love these people and the history of SF. Let me know your favorite story about an author of science fiction. I'd love to hear it. Please comment. Until next time, keep reading.